Christmas has always been my favorite holiday of the year. A time when dreams are meant to come true. But the story I'm about to tell you is one that has stayed with me, even 27 years later. I'm 34 now, and this happened when I was just 7 years old. It all started 2 days before Christmas. My parents needed to do some last-minute Christmas shopping before the big day. They dropped me off at one of those North Pole Santa grottos in the center of the mall. They assured me it would only take about 15 minutes. I sighed and made my way over to the stereotypical mall Santa. White long beard, big red coat, and everything you'd expect. The line wasn't very long, and within a few minutes, it was my turn. The man playing Santa looked like he was in his 60s. His beard seemed unkempt, like it hadn't been washed in weeks. He called me over, sat me on his knee, and asked what I wanted for Christmas. Excitedly, I told him I wanted the new Nintendo console, an early model that every kid dreamed of having back then. His response, however, took me by surprise. With a strange smile, he asked for my home address so he could know where to deliver my gift. Being a naive 7-year-old who wholeheartedly believed in the magic of Santa Claus, I gave him my address without a second thought. He dismissed me with a wave and a smile as I ran off to find my parents, who were in a clothing store next to the grotto. I wish the story ended there, but what happened on Christmas Eve still sends shivers down my spine. That night, I woke up to a dark and quiet room. It was still pitch black outside, and the winter snow had piled up against my bedroom window. I felt dehydrated and decided to go downstairs to the kitchen for a glass of water before going back to bed. But then I remembered, I'd have to pass the living room, where the Christmas tree was. My parents had always told me I wasn't allowed in the living room until morning because Santa would see me. Despite my fear, my thirst won, and I crept out of my room. As I stepped onto the balcony overlooking the living room, something caught my eye. There, in the glow of the Christmas tree lights, stood a very tall man dressed in a long red robe and wearing a Santa hat. He also had a large red sack slung over his shoulder. I froze, staring in disbelief. Quietly, I turned and slipped into my 5-year-old sister's room to wake her. I wanted to tell her that Santa was here. But when I entered, her bed was empty. She was gone. This shocked me because she never left her room in the middle of the night. Panicked, I returned to the balcony. To my horror, I saw 3 other men, dressed in elf costumes, entering the living room. My sister was there now, being handed a gift by the man dressed as Santa. The elves led her toward the front door. I screamed. The sound startled the 4 men, and they backed out of the door, leaving my sister crying in the doorway. Not fully understanding what had just happened, I comforted her and made her promise not to tell our parents. I led her back to her room and tucked her into bed. I didn't even bother getting water. Instead, I went back to my room, pulled the blankets over my head, and tried to forget everything I'd seen. To this day, I don't know who those men were or what their intentions might have been. I never saw that dirty old Santa at the mall again. But I'm certain it was him at my house that night. That Christmas remains the most haunting memory of my life. This story happened 4 years ago on Christmas Eve. My wife and I live in a house somewhat out in the country. The homes in our neighborhood are spaced far apart, and we have a fairly large yard. That night, at about 9 p.m., I was startled by a knocking sound coming from our front door. It was unusual, given how remote our area is, so I walked over to the window to see who it could be. To my surprise, when I looked outside, there was nobody there. Feeling uneasy, I went to every window in the house to check for anyone lurking outside. Despite it being dark, I couldn't see anyone at all. It was strange, but I assumed it must have been some kind of prank. What else could it be? It had snowed that night, and the next morning, when I woke up, I noticed something unsettling. There were footprints all over our backyard. Footprints that hadn't been there the night before. They seemed to lead directly to my shed in the back. Concerned, I decided to walk out to the shed to see if anything was amiss. As I opened the shed door, I was met with a horrifying sight. A man was standing in the corner. He turned to look at me, then suddenly charged toward me. I panicked and turned to run as fast as I could back to the house. Thankfully, I managed to get inside and lock the door before he could catch me. Shaking, I quickly called the police and watched from the safety of the window. The man, to my horror, went back into the shed. When the police arrived, they arrested him. It turned out he was under the influence of drugs and had wandered into the area. That Christmas Eve was one of the most terrifying nights of my life, and I'll never forget the sight of that man charging at me from the shed. I'm a 20-year-old female, and this incident happened 2 years ago, just before Christmas. My family was hosting my aunts and cousins, and I went to a nearby shopping center to pick up a last-minute gift for my aunt. I wasn't sure what to get her, but after some time, I found a nice hat that I thought she would like. While browsing through the store before leaving, a man approached me. He looked to be in his 30s, had a shaved head, and immediately gave off a creepy vibe. He walked up to me and casually asked how I was doing. Feeling uneasy, I replied politely, saying I was fine and was about to leave. Then, he asked where I was going and if I wanted to get some drinks with him. I told him no thanks and started to walk away. To my discomfort, the man followed me, persisting by asking what was wrong and why I didn't want to go with him. Realizing he wasn't going to stop, I turned to him and firmly told him to stop following me. Thankfully, the store was crowded, and a few people glanced over at the commotion. The man finally stepped back, muttered "fine," and walked away. I stayed in the store for a while longer to make sure he had left. Feeling safer, I bought the hat for my aunt and left the store to head to my car. As I started driving away, I noticed an old van nearby. The same man was sticking his head out of the window, smiling at me in the creepiest way imaginable. It sent chills down my spine. I carefully drove away, making sure he wasn't following me. Luckily, I made it back home safely. But even now, I feel fortunate that the store was so busy because the way that man smiled at me was something I'll never forget.